Okay, hello everyone, and thanks for attending this webinar on the 6 principles of the GDPR and SQL Provision. My name's Karis, and I'm a product marketing manager here at Redgate for SQL Provision. We also have MVP Steve Jones, who'll be presenting the webinar today. So if you have any questions, then please add them to the questions box on screen, and we'll aim to answer them as we go. But we have also saved some time at the end if we don't get round to them. I'll also be sending around a copy of the recording and the slides within the next few days for those that do want to rewatch it or share it with colleagues. And I'm now going to hand over to Steve.
Thanks, Karis. Welcome, everybody, and hopefully you're having a wonderful day wherever you are, whether you're in the US or over in Europe or UK. So this is the webinar on the 6 principles of the GDPR and SQL Provision. I'm Steve Jones, as Karis said. I work for Redgate Software as an evangelist, and I'm also the editor of SQL Server Central. And I've been working with SQL Server and databases for, about 30 years now, and SQL Server for the vast majority of that time. I've worked in big companies and some small companies in a variety of different industries throughout the time. And I've worked in regulated industries as well as non-regulated industries. So I've had to deal with similar types of legislation and compliance issues that we're talking about and we're dealing with the GDPR. Now, Redgate is a company based in Cambridge in the UK, and so we are bound by the GDPR, and so we've been doing a bunch of work to get ready for that as well. Now, my contact information is up there on the screen. If you need to get a hold of me, please feel free to do so, and then we'll have some other contact information at the end if you want. Now, before we start, one quick disclaimer, this isn't really legal advice. I know the GDPR is legislation and it's law now in the EU, but the enforcement will start in a few weeks on May 25th. So we haven't, had our solicitors and lawyers take a review of this information and trying to give you a perspective of things that we've learned as we've been doing preparation and as we are working with our customers on trying to be prepared in terms of building their software. So I'm not a lawyer. I've never had legal training, so just disclose that. So our quick agenda is we want to talk a little bit about our 6 principles of the GDPR as how they relate to software delivery, and then talk a little bit about compliance. And at the very end, I'm going to do a short demo of SQL Provision and talk a little bit about how this could help you. And certainly at Redgate, we would love for you to use our software. We think we have some great tools that can help you, but it's more important that you kind of understand the principles of what we're trying to show you and what SQL Provision will do. And so whether you use our software or somewhere else, is understand how this could help you in building software better, but we would love for you to give Redgate a try. Now, I'd like to start with this, that, we started looking at the GDPR a couple years ago and trying to change our tools and build some new tools to help our customers. A lot of what we realized with the GDPR is that the principles embodied in there really are just good principles that we would want for any type of data that we do. They're the type of ideas and I guess principles, I'd say principles so much, but it's the type of thing that I would have done working at many companies across the years and tried to do. And while you might feel GDPR is overreaching or it's burdensome, it really is kind of a good solid idea of how we would want to manage data and protect it and ensure that it's safe and we're working with everything fairly with our customers. So that's one of the things I'd like to take away from this, that you would think about. Really, this is an opportunity for us to do a better job of handling data rather than some annoying burden that we just have to deal with. Now, the GDPR has it's 99 articles. There's a lot of different parts of it, but one of the key things for us as data professionals, as software developers, is that we need to ensure that anything that we're doing with data, we've built into the system by design and default. Now, for many applications I've worked in, many of the people I've worked with over the years, that hasn't been the case. We often haven't thought about security and protection and certainly privacy by default. We've kind of added that on later, or it's something we'll deal with once the application is in use. But in the GDPR, we're asking that you be able to demonstrate your compliance. So whether you're a data controller in charge of the data or the processor that has to manage the data, we want to make sure that we are building in any good data protection principles into our system by default. And so for those of you that have existing applications and existing databases and software, it means we should be changing our processes, changing the way that we do things so that we've considered good protection, good privacy rules by default in here. That's kind of our mode of operation going forward, and that will be a huge something that the regulators or the authorities will view as a positive in your effect if you have any type of issue with them, if you have to interact with them, or if you have to go through some sort of audit, and certainly some sort of legal issue where you might incur a fine. If you show that I've adopted these principles that are designed to ensure we are protecting data, we are trying to protect privacy, it will greatly reduce the amount of your fines. Now, one of the things that is come out with the GDPR is that there isn't a prescriptive set of advice. It doesn't say turn on SQL Server encryption. It doesn't say make sure that you have a firewall in place. There's nothing in there that the language is designed to say you should be using appropriate technical measures. And those certainly will change over time as technology grows and alters and we have better ways to protect our systems. That will change, but we want to implement what we see as appropriate technical measures for protection right now. Now, all of these things listed come under this purview, in that typically what we do want to do is we want to have some documentation about what we're doing, because the GDPR asks us to understand why we're actually making changes or handling data or doing anything else. We certainly need some sort of protection, which could be encryption, it could be other types of rules like VPNs or privacy rules that limit access. And then we certainly want to include anonymization or pseudonymization. I'm not sure I'm ever going to get that word correct, but we want to ensure that in places where it's appropriate, there isn't an easy way or a good way to tie back data to an individual, because we are trying to protect their privacy. We definitely need to manage change as well to ensure that we know what's going on, and that kind of goes along with all of our documentation. And then for those of us who are data professionals, we often know that things will crop up. We will have to fight fires. We will have emergencies. We will have time-sensitive things that we have to handle. And we need some way to ensure that we are handling this in an appropriate manner, just so that we can be sure, or we can demonstrate later that we did the best we could, or we did it with an intention of providing protection, ensuring accuracy, something that is required by the compliance of the GDPR. So the GDPR doesn't tell us what we can and can't do, but it says that we should be doing things appropriately to meet the spirit or the goals of the legislation. Now, one thing I do want to point out to you is that we are accountable for compliance here. So those of us that are data controllers, meaning that we are the ones that collect the data, or we're in charge of it, we're kind of responsible for ensuring compliance. Over a third of the GDPR articles actually say that you have to be able to demonstrate and show that you are complying with the principles. So this is a really big deal. And most data professionals understand that documentation is important, but we don't always have that built into our processes, especially in large organizations. And so we want to be sure that we let our manager know, our management know, our coworkers know that we have to demonstrate that we are doing the best job we can, because we're responsible for this. Now, we have a couple of quick polls, and I want to kick one off now to ask you how you are getting prepared now. I know that the deadline is a few weeks away for enforcement. I know plenty of companies are still working along trying to get compliant. At Redgate, we're doing the same thing. I think we're mostly compliant, but we still have work to do. And the authorities recognize that not everybody will be compliant on day one, but it's important that you're showing that you're working towards that thing. So I'll give you a minute or so for go through the poll, and I'm going to take a sip of coffee. And seems like quite a few of you are voted, so that's good. I'm going to, let's close. It's long enough. Sorry, I run out of tolerance with the poll sometimes, so there you go. All right, let's move into our 6 principles, and let's get going and see what things we at Redgate think are important for you. Now, one of the first principles of the GDPR is that we should be lawful, fair, and transparent in how we work with data. Now, GDPR Article 5 has got a lot of the relevant information for us as data professionals that we probably want to focus on. And so one of those in 1A says that any data that we have to process it, which means we're collecting it, we're transforming it, we're aggregating it, we're sharing it. Anything that we're doing with data, essentially, we need to do it in kind of a fair and transparent manner with whoever that data is about, whether that's actually a human individual, an entity, a legal entity of some sort. We want to be sure that we're kind of clear and transparent in what we're going to do with the data, and that's important. And typically, those of us that have data about us, we would like to know how some organization, whether it's a for-profit company or government or anything else, we want to know how they're dealing with our data. What are they actually doing with it? And what protections or what sensitivity is there for that data? How is it shared or used? And we haven't done that in many organizations I've worked with. Most companies have collected the data and haven't felt any obligation to the individual. And just me as an individual, I think that's the wrong way of approaching it. We should understand that while this data is an asset to our organization, it's also an asset to that individual, and it's important that we treat it with the respect it deserves. And so the GDPR kind of codifies this for once to say that we actually have to be transparent in what we are going to do with the data. Okay? Now, what does that mean for us data professionals? Well, we should know what data we hold. That sounds obvious, but I've worked in many organizations where we weren't quite sure exactly where all the data was or what it meant, or who had collected it and why we had it. So having some handle on what the size of your data estate is and what data you have is very important, especially when we start to talk about sensitive data about individuals. If we don't know what data is out there, we can't classify it, and then we may not actually protect it. So it's important that we know this. And then the second part of this is something that I've never had to deal with in an organization, and that's the issue of consent. Do I know what consent I have to actually maneuver or work with this data? If I want to transform it, if I want to sell it to a partner or share it with a partner, business partner, if I want to use it in a new application. These days, those of us in the data processing area or the data professional area, we're always looking for new ways with machine learning and AI and these massive quantities of data. How can we analyze it and find new uses for it? Well, we've got to have consent to do that. Doesn't mean that you can't do it. It means that now in the GDPR, we have to be sure that we are asking for consent. I expect that EULAs and other legal documents are going to start becoming a bigger part of all our applications, but we should certainly be sure that the data that we're handling and the data that we're working with in the EULA or the consent we've got, the things those match up. So that's probably going to be something that those of us as data professionals have to deal with it. And so we have to be sure that anything that we expect we're going to do with data, we have disclosed that to our customers. And so that's a little bit of a change for many of us. Okay. And let's move on to number 2. So purpose limitation. So this kind of goes with that consent, and that the data that we collect that's personal, so something that can be tied to an individual, human, or legal entity, is collected for certain purposes, right? And the Article 5.1b actually says specified, explicit, legitimate purposes, and then it's not processed in a manner that's incompatible or different from those purposes. So that goes along with us trying to be sure that we understand what we're doing with data, and then we've disclosed it to customers. Now, many organizations I've worked with, somebody has an idea of what to do with an application. They build some software and they collect some data and they start to work with it, and then they may realize they do something different. Certainly, those of us that have worked in smaller companies might realize there's this idea of pivoting to change and do something different with your entire company. Well, we've done that with data for a long time, but we can't do that any longer if we're bound by the GDPR or similar legislation. So for those of you that I know that are in Europe and UK, you're GDPR focused. Those of you that might be elsewhere might be thinking maybe it's tangentially related to us, but there's legislation in many other countries that's similar to the GDPR that is asking for these same things. So you want to keep that in mind. I've found far too often in organizations that we start to collect data and we don't really understand why, and we keep it around and we may use it for something else, but we often do it without having a clear intention of what we're doing. And the GDPR is just asking that you have some clear purpose here. It doesn't put any limits on what that purpose is. It doesn't say anything, about what you, decide to do in terms of how I process data. It just says that I have to disclose what that is and then let people know. And it has to be legitimate in that I can't say I'm going to do one thing with my data and that one thing is something that's illegal or it's vague in some way. I have to have some legitimate purpose here that says a user or a customer, an individual about who the data is about, the data subject in the GDPR language would understand what that purpose is. Okay. Now, for us in the software world, as we're building this, we have to think about this in a few ways. That if we're actually going to use this data to build software, we have to understand that that has to be disclosed, but also when we use that data in other places, we're expanding our attack surface area where people may want to look at that data. And in terms of software development, this is one of those things that we have to be careful about, because we often copy data and share it within our organization in a way that individuals, users may not expect. And so as part of our purpose, as part of the way we're doing things, we have to make sure that we are protecting or anonymizing, changing that PII data in our other environments. And so that's one of those things that we want to talk about with this webinar, that SQL Provision helps you do that. The concept is that I want to be sure that anywhere that I'm going to process this data to help me build software, I am including protections in it in some way. And so we'll give you a few ideas and a few ways you can do that moving forward. Now, 1C in Article 5 talks about data minimization. And this is one of those areas, as I talk to people, especially in the US, they get a little confused about, and they think about this as, well, I just need to delete lots of data, so I only use small data sets. And that's not really what they mean by data minimization. What the idea here is that the data that we're collecting is limited in some way to ensure that it's just for the purposes of processing. So that's limit in scope and type of processing we do. It's also limited in terms of the security portion of this. So when we collect this data, we don't want to keep it longer than we have, and we don't want to do anything with it that we haven't disclosed or we haven't received consent to do. And then we don't want to have this data used in ways that may be causing it to be less secure or to be less protected for the actual data subject itself. And so for those of us in the software world, we got to think about the different ways that data moves through our organization. Often we don't just have this data appearing in one database. It often gets moved into other databases, data warehouses, data marts, used for different purposes, such as marketing, such as CRM type data that's used in sales, separate from the transactional area where it's picked up, certainly used in business intelligence and analysis. And so we want to be sure that if there's PII data, we are somehow protecting that. So it's not that we can't have BI systems that aggregate our data and give us visualizations of how sales are going or what campaigns work well. It's that we want to make sure that we either remove this data, remove any linkage back to the data subject through an aggregation of some sort. So essentially we're collecting all this data together, and then we're removing the individual detail elements, because what we really care about is the gross pattern of that data. Or if we do need to include those detail elements, that we mask, anonymize, some way protect this data. You know, Microsoft has certainly done some changes in SQL Server across the last few versions to help here. We've got things like dynamic data masking, like always encrypted, things that should help us protect data in different ways. But we have to be sure in how we process it as data professionals that we are ensuring that we are actually protecting this data, and that we minimize the scale, scope, and surface area of how this data might be used. Now this next one, number 4, is a big one for me, data accuracy. Now I've always considered a kind of a hallmark of me as a data professional that the data that I deal with, the data that I handle, is accurate. And I understand certainly that I may do transformations or cleanup of data along the way, but I have to be sure that when I do that, that it means it's accurate as possible. So if I'm correcting data, if I'm transforming it, I can't change the fundamental meanings there. And if I get data from somebody that isn't accurate, I need to correct it. And a lot of us do ad hoc changes regularly to correct data that may be a mistake. Somebody mistyped something. There's a bug in a program that causes an issue. We want to make sure that's accurate. And the GDPR actually now codifies the fact that we have a responsibility to make sure data is accurate. And not only that it's accurate, but it's accurate within a reasonable amount of time. So there's language and there are parts of the GDPR legislation that talk about certain time limits to respond to issues. I think 30 days is one of the time frames in there. That means we have to be able to handle changes in 30 days. And while that sounds like that shouldn't be hard, somebody lets me know about something that can fix it. Many of us deal with volumes of data, and so the scale of responding can be an issue. And so we need better processes and ways to ensure that we can correct things without delay. Many of us have, well, if you're like me or you're older, you've grown up in a more of an analog world, we've realized that sometimes we work at a slower pace, and that doesn't scale very well in today's digital systems, that we can't take days and days to do something. We've got to be able to handle things much, much quicker because we have no idea the volume of things. So the GDPR actually says, right, that we must take every reasonable step to ensure that anything that is inaccurate is erased or rectified. And the erase thing is a dangerous item. For those of us that deal with data, the easiest thing in the world would be just to collect less data or try to get rid of data. And there are companies in the UK that have actually decided to do this. There's some companies that have gotten rid of some of their customer programs and customer databases because they don't want to have this liability and responsibility for this data. But for many of us, we're not in that position, or we don't want to do that. And so the idea that we would fall out of compliance and be fined and have to erase data is certainly scary. And then changing it as well is something that could be a problem. So these are issues that we have to think about moving forward. How are we going to handle this? And for me, that means I need to have some automation in place that I understand that if there's a name or an address or a tax ID number or something else that is incorrect, I want to have known ways to change that very quickly. So I don't want to necessarily be editing a script each time. I'd rather have a DevOps style pipeline and some tooling that would say I can in essence submit an ID and a change that would go through, and I guarantee that this would be made in every place that it happens. All right, and that's the important thing, because some of this data will not just exist in one database. It may exist in multiple places in that database, in multiple databases, or in multiple systems. So the takeaway here, I think, from data accuracy is that, again, you have to understand the size and scale of the data you hold. Where is all this PII data? I want to understand how it's used and shared across different systems. And then I want to be sure that I can actually update and correct any anomalies, any mistakes in a timely manner. That's going to be very important moving forward, because having that process in place and showing that I can accomplish this will dramatically reduce the potential fines that I would face, because I want to be sure that if I have an issue, I don't have a huge issue. I want to have a small issue. Just like those of us that build software, we want to try something and we want to fail fast. We don't want to have big failures. We want to have small failures. And we understand we're going to have data anomalies. We're going to have mistakes made along the way. We're going to have things go wrong. What's important is that we have some way to correct this in a timely manner. And if you're like me, in an easy manner. I don't want to have to go dig out scripts and figure it out. I essentially want tooling that says, oh, I know the name is spelled wrong. Here's the ID, the key to find that name. Here's the actual correction, and have a system ensure that the change is made, and then I have a record of what change I actually made as well. So number 5, talking about storage limitation. And for those of us in the data world, this often has different connotations than it does for the GDPR. But really what this means is that we are not keeping data around forever if we don't need it, and we haven't disclosed that there's an actual view for this. So for those of us that may deal in e-commerce and sales, we may sell some product of some sort, we often have to keep that data for a certain period of time for legal and tax reasons. So in the US, I have to keep records of sales for 7 years for the tax service in the US to look at. But after 7 years, I don't have that. Now, most organizations I've worked with, we just keep those records forever. As a matter of fact, I once worked for an import-export company that was over 100 years old. The company had been in existence for over 100 years, which in US terms is a huge length of time. In European terms is not so long, but For us, it was a long time, and we actually had records going back hundreds of years. We had sales records. We had a large, about 20-foot by 30-foot sales storage area in a big metal warehouse, and it was full of boxes of records and files and paper, some of which were probably illegible and unreadable, and we just kept those records for no particular reason. It was unlikely anybody was ever going to go through them. Maybe historians at some point would want to go through them, but in terms of the business, there was no reason to keep those. And the GDPR now is saying that if you have no reason to keep data, you shouldn't keep it around. And for me as a data professional, that's a core data protection concept that I like, that I've always tried to do. One of the things I've done in any organization I've worked with is ask the question, should we keep all this data around? Now, early on in my career, we were in this place where we tried to minimize the amount of data we kept over time and also collected because the cost of storage was high. It was just expensive for disk drives to store data. And then we reached a point as I grew up and the industry grew up that the cost of storage fell dramatically. So I remember my first computer had 256K of RAM, and that was an expensive thing, right? And we used disk storage, floppy disk storage on 8-inch floppies, which cost dollars for a few hundred K of storage. And that's changed to where now a terabyte is not necessarily a large cost. It's not a large amount of storage. And so we get to this point where we collect more and more data, but we collect it and keep it with not necessarily knowing why we keep it, not necessarily having a purpose design, and not necessarily having a reason for doing so. And keeping that data around does mean there are costs, even if they're lower. We have storage costs. There's management costs of dealing with them. There's resource costs of actually moving that data around. If you've ever had to restore a large database or copy things to different locations, there's actually a time and effort involved in this at scale. It's difficult to do. And then there's a liability question as well, that the longer I keep data around, I'm potentially liable if there's a breach or some sort of release. That's a problem. And so GDPR is saying that if you no longer need that data, if you don't have any specific use and you don't have any legal requirement, you shouldn't have that any longer. And that means we should have retention policies. I've often tried to get these implemented. I've struggled in the US in the past. I think now that is starting to become easier and easier. And interestingly enough, lawyers and legal profession, they are usually much more amenable to having retention policies because they recognize liability over time. And they understand that something that's 10 or 15 or 20 years old, I still have some amount of liability for that. And if I don't need it and I can get rid of it, then I can reduce my liability. And so for those of us that work in data professionals, we should be talking with our management and with our clients and customers and trying to make sure that we have some retention policy for data and that we have potential lifetime for some data. Certainly there may be things we keep forever. We certainly may want to keep aggregations and non-PII data in some sense for a long period of time. But other than that, we should have some retention policy that at least explicitly defines we're going to keep this data forever, or that we are only going to keep this data for 10 years or something else, and we're going to reduce it and get rid of it, or archive it out or something else. That's good data protection stuff. If I can archive out data, my system tends to perform better. I have more flexibility in managing my database. Certainly my DR and HA is much better and quicker. When I set up new nodes for some type of clustering, or if I have to set up training or disaster recovery or anything else, having less data just benefits me. Okay? And the same thing occurs, we have to think about multiple environments with our development and testing, that we don't necessarily want data in those environments around forever. It may be less relevant to our development process, which doesn't help us in dev and test to try to build new applications. We have liability if we have other data there. We certainly have potential surface area issues that if we were to have a data breach, we don't want to deal with that. And SQL Provision is designed to kind of deal with some of these problems and help you ensure that the data that's in my dev and test environments is masked or anonymized and is protected, and I'm not using as much storage as possible. all the things that we would want to do as data professionals and as a set of people that want to kind of do a good job but not have any liability or responsibility or accountability. We want to reduce that as much as possible. That's what we want to try to help you do as well. And the last principle today is integrity and confidentiality, which is certainly something that I've always taken very seriously as a database professional. That I want to ensure that the data I work with is secure. And I've tended to treat development environments similar to production environments, because to me, development is the production environment for my developers. If it goes down, if we have issues there, my developers can't work. Now, certainly, I have to keep in mind that there's flexibility in development areas too, so that's always a challenge. But the GDPR is telling me that any place that I've got personal data, that I am protecting it, I am not processing it in some way that I haven't disclosed, but I also am using all the technical skills that I have to ensure that I don't lose it or have it damaged or have a data breach in some way. And so, to me, this is one of the more difficult principles in the GDPR, because a lot of times people outside of the technical area or outside of the development area don't understand how difficult this is, or how much trouble this can be. And I've often found management is asking me to shortcut issues so that development can move faster. Many of you probably heard of DevOps or work in DevOps or being pressured to do DevOps style development, which is faster, smaller changes more and more. That requires some flexibility, and that requires that sometimes we're moving faster and we're experimenting and trying different things. And as we all know, we are not necessarily putting the same hardware resources, both from a capacity standpoint as well as a security standpoint, into development areas as we do in production. And the GDPR is saying that anywhere we've got that data, we have to do that. And so it's important that as we try to build our software and as we may have less controls in place in development, that we are still complying with all the principles. So we want to be sure that we can prove that we've got compliance in all these different areas. So we've secured the data so in some way that it complies with principles. So I would say, and again, not being a lawyer, if my development environments and my test environments are not as protected as the production environments, I'm probably out of compliance in some way. I've got to really think about that from the GDPR standpoint, because again, it's not the security of the system and the software, it's the security of the data. And that's what's really important, that I've got to protect data. And that's one of those things with SQL Provision, that we've designed it to help you protect the data and still move in a DevOps style fashion, where you can produce software, you can accomplish the goals that can meet all the business requirements in a quick manner. Now, certainly automation and documentation are the key here. And that's one of the things that I try to preach as a developer, that DevOps isn't telling me what to do, just like the GDPR isn't telling me what to do, but it is giving me ways to produce software better. And I need to do that with automation and then a record of what's happening. One of the keys as a developer of having that documentation, which isn't a Word document, right? But this is documentation of what happened, what's going on, logging essentially, is that it helps me solve problems very quickly, right? Because I understand what's happening in the software, what's happening in the development process. But I want to have that so that I can move faster. But the side benefit of that is that it also shows that I understand what's happening with my systems from a regulatory standpoint, from an auditing standpoint. And so as the GDPR says, I can't just say I'm compliant. I can't say I've enabled encryption. I actually have to prove these things to a regulatory authority if there's ever any doubt or ever any issue. All right, so those are our 6 principles. Let's now move forward into what does this mean for those of building software from a data perspective. So some of you may be developers, some of you may be DBAs or database developers, something else. But in essence, when we build software, we've got an entire pipeline. We're trying to deliver software, and that goes from the customer talking to an analyst or an architect to making decisions about what to do, and then that goes to maybe project managers and developers and QA people and operations people and everything else. From a data standpoint, we want to understand what data we're processing and certainly what roles we have for doing that. And we then have to understand what part of that data needs protecting. So what's personal data? That's the thing we have to protect. Certainly access is an issue as well. And as we go from, again, those production environments to development environments, we are enhancing the scope of who sees the data, and we're certainly enhancing the access that they may have. So we have to understand who has that access and what are they doing with it. We want to ensure that we're protecting the data in some way so that despite more people having access or different people having access, that we've got protection in place. And then we want to be aware of the potential for any kind of security issue, some kind of data breach. Across the years, I've been tracking data breaches. There's a number of organizations that do this, and you can go see what's breached. You'd be surprised perhaps how often a test or development or proof of concept system is where data is actually lost. It's not the production system, it's some software development system. And so we have to protect that in some way. And to me, that means I have to be really careful about how I move this data around. I have to understand the issues there. And as much as possible, I do want to anonymize and protect that data or mask it out. And again, with the GDPR, the whole issue is that don't just tell me what you're doing, you have to prove to me that it's happening. And as a data professional and software developer, that means I need automated processes that happen in a repeatable, reliable manner every time. They are consistent from day to day. I'm not dependent on a human to do these things. Humans are great at creativity and figuring out how to solve problems. They're horrible about being consistent in their processing day after day after day after day. We've seen that for decades in this industry where the human is often the weakest link because we get in a hurry, we get busy, we get distracted, and we do things differently. And those are the holes, those are the places that hackers or malicious individuals will exploit. Now, many of us do copy down live data from production when we move to other environments, and I understand why. I've done this for years. It's the easiest thing to do, but I've always been worried about it. And these days, with all the security issues and more personal data in our systems, it's one thing I don't want to do. And we've been surveying people. We've produced a state of database DevOps every year, and we've been surveying customers for the last few years, trying to understand what they do with data. And it's nice to see at least half people use a modified copy of production, but often this is a subsetted copy, not a masked or anonymized set. And so that's not great. I wish more people use synthesized or manually created sets of data, but I understand why they don't do those, because those are not necessarily representative production. They're not necessarily helping us build better software. So we have this challenge of trying to deal with our development environments with production data. And so now I do actually want to poll and see if this has changed very much for any of you that are out there. Do you actually copy down production in its entirety? So you just restore production in QA or development. Do you somehow modify that so you delete 90% of the data, or you have scripts that mask and obfuscate things along the way? Or do you synthesize with a data generator type of thing, like SQL data generator from Redgate, or manually create your own data, right? Developers are responsible for creating data. They're all valid ways of doing software development. But I would say in all my years, what I've wanted is a modified copy of production for the most part. And I found better ways to do this, and I think Redgate has done a great job of figuring out how to do this in a manner that's smooth and easy. It doesn't add a lot of process to what I'm doing, but it provides me security as well as a data set in development that is of the size, scope, and scale and SKU that I really need, right? It's the shape of production.
Actually, Steve, now's probably a really good time to take a question as well. We've had someone ask a question, which is, what is defined as personal data by the GDPR?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So they have a kind of a vague framework of what is personal data. It's essentially anything that can be tied back to a specific individual. Now, I know some of us might want to get pedantic about this, that if I know your year of birth and your last location and the movie you watch on Netflix, I can figure out who you are, right? There's some really strong data analysis, data science things that can be done with multiple data sets. But in the GDPR terms, really, if you've got a set of data that is tracking some action, right, whether that's a sale, whether that's a click on a website, anything that you've got that tracks back to a specific individual within that data set. So if I'm storing a name, that obviously can track back to a person. If I have, a location or, a time and an IP address, that could track back to a specific individual, because I could potentially track that back to a computer that a person owns. Even though we could argue about whether or not that gets to a specific individual, you got to remember you're going to deal with auditors that aren't necessarily extremely technical, and they'll view it in a way that says, yeah, this is the common sense perspective would be, yes, this tracks back to an individual. Certainly tax IDs, credit card numbers, physical addresses, email addresses, all those types of things are personal data. There are probably edge cases that could go either way, but I think from my perspective as a data professional, I want to be careful about trying to be too general with that or too tight with that definition. I want to say if I think I could track this back to somebody, I probably can, and I want to protect it.
So yeah, an extension question to that actually is obviously first name and last name would be defined as personal data, but would kind of first name or last name alone be defined as personal data?
That's a good question. I think that would depend on what the rest of the data set is in your application. So if I have just last names and I have email addresses, that might be. I think if you're trying to look at individual data items in an abstract way, they don't, right? So for me, Jones, is Jones personally identifiable? No. I mean, it's in the US, it's like the second most common name I think around. So it's not, right? And even Steve Jones isn't really going to identify me for the most part. But Steve Jones with SQL Server pretty much identifies me. I do know another Steve Jones, but only one. I think you have to examine first name and last name, or just first name, with the rest of your data set. So if you have a birthday, if you have an email, if you have a physical address, those things will come into play. And really, it's that entire data set that you have to mask there, right? So it's not necessarily the customer ID or the customer status or something else, but in a development environment, if I were to lose control of this data set, that row of data, is it a problem? Or if I were to lose control of this database, can I track that back to somebody? So it's certainly a tricky thing to do, and I know there are, there's single names, right, like Sting or Madonna or Prince, that you could say, well, we know who that is. Absolutely true. The key is, I think, if you could track this back, if you think you could track this back, not 7 research scientists at Cambridge could do it, but you could do this, you probably want to be sure that you're protecting it. So let me move on. I know there's a few more questions, but let's move on. I'll get to those. So when we try to build these test and development environments, we want to be compliant with GDPR in some way. And so there's a number of things we've identified with Redgate, from talking to customers and business partners about this, things they need to do to ensure that we're not going to accidentally do something that's against the GDPR when we build our test databases, our development databases, that kind of thing. So the first thing is understanding the entire scope of our data estate. So do I know where all the copies of my data are? So if I'm at Redgate and we have a database for sales where you can buy our software online, certainly our developers have copies of that database. Do I know where all those copies are? Are they on individual laptops? Are they on specific servers? Are they on test systems in EC2 or build systems? Do I know where those are? The second thing is that I should have some control over how I make a copy and who can do that, because I think when we go from production to development, that is a weak point where we are actually crossing that protection boundary, right? All the protections in production for access and limitations and everything we've got in place, and then we take a backup or we do an ETL or something else, there's a kind of a hole at that one point where somebody can see both production and non-production. So do I have kind of control over that? Do I have a way to understand what data is sensitive, and so that I need to protect it? So certainly we've said first name, last name, emails, all those things. Do I have a way to actually protect that data, and do I understand what data that is? And then, am I doing this consistently? It doesn't do me any good to copy this data and obfuscate it every time, and then a junior DBA or developer or a different sysadmin does this one time and they forget to follow part of this process. There's one reason why automation becomes really important, because this shouldn't depend on me, it shouldn't depend on Grant or somebody else to run through the entire process. Whoever can run that process should have the same process take place, and we should be able to prove that that happens for an auditing purpose. And then we want to have documentation every time this happens. One of the things that's very difficult for us is that the technical people, or for me when I'm in operations, is that I have to be perfect every single time. I can't make mistakes, right? The criminal or the malicious actor only has to have success one time for there to be a big issue. So these are all the things I need to do when I'm trying to build test and development environments in a compliant way. I need to handle all these things. But I certainly have a conflict, because these days, businesses are asking for developers to move faster and deliver more features. They see their mobile apps, they see websites that implement new features on a regular basis that are moving faster. You know, the Facebook, the Googles, Spotify's, they're kind of the blame for this, right? They're moving so fast that they make the rest of us look bad. And so, granted, they have different resources, different business models, but we still have to compete with that. Our management, our customers, our clients see that, and so they want to move fast. And software developers need up-to-date, realistic data and consistent, good copies of databases if they want to move faster as well. And so that's our challenge, while still accounting for all those copies of data, sanitizing sensitive data out of there, and limiting access wherever possible. Right? And DBAs often are a limited resource, so we need a way that we can move as fast as teams can do. Now, Redgate, we've taken these concepts. There's other companies that do similar things, but the idea is that we all understand that the way to really do this is we have to have self-service. We have to do what we call data virtualization. We have to provide masking and anonymization protection. And Redgate's doing this with our SQL Provision bundle. Now that's really built of two products that we sell separately as well, I guess, but it doesn't make sense to do them separately in my mind. You should have both. SQL clone technology, which allows us to go very fast and save tons of disk space. And it's kind of an amazing piece of technology that if I'd have had this 20 years ago, it would have dramatically changed how I built database software. It's one of the few things I think that I could say that I wish I'd had back then. And the other product is Data Masker. Now, Data Masker does what it says. It allows you to mask anonymized data. I've done this by manually in the past, which if I've got one system to deal with, that's fine. When I have to deal with multiple applications, multiple databases, it's a bit more of a challenge, and Data Masker makes it really easy. And it also transfers that intelligence from one developer to the next one, because they can follow the process, they can see what's done, and they're not trying to decode all the scripts in the T-SQL I've written, or the C# that I've written in the way to make this happen. We do this in a way that makes it really easy. So I want to demo some of this so we can just see, you can see how it works and then understand what works really well. So let me start here. So I've got one database here where I'm doing development, right? This is my Data Masker Steve database that we can see up here. And so I'm doing development, I've got customer names and things like that. And we could assume this is a copy of production, so this isn't necessarily the best way for me to do things. I've got email addresses and addresses, and certainly this would be PI information. And I want to test some of my software, right? Maybe I'm building a website or a C# mobile application or something else. And so I decided I'm going to do something and I'm going too fast. And I realized very quickly that I've kind of blown up my development system slightly. I know some of you may laugh and think, well, I wouldn't do that. I've been a very successful developer and database professional. I've done this more times than I would care to admit. It just happens. I'm busy. Somebody distracts me. I doing something like this and I don't realize what I'm doing, and so I've blown up my data set. Well, one of the nice things about SQL Clone is that it allows me to fix things very quickly. So I've actually built this database as a clone database, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete it. I'm going to reclone it back out. So this is self-service for me as a developer. Just type. I can't type and talk at the same time. Let's do that. So I'm going to rebuild this database. Now, This is a 100 megabyte database. It's not very big in general. That's the amount of data. But when I clone it, I'm only using half that amount of space. And really, this number here is fairly consistent for a new database in SQL clone. Whether this number up here is 100 megabytes, or maybe that's gigabytes, if I can type, or terabytes or something else, I can dramatically save the amount of disk space. And if I flip back over here, you'll notice I haven't done anything to this database. I didn't even have to rebuild my connection. My data is back in place because clone allows me to virtualize out that data. It gives me certainly a database that I can change like this, but it's dramatically reduced the amount of disk space that I use. And you can see now I've just changed to one row. I did things correctly. And this might change slightly over time. You can see Grant's database is slightly larger because he's been doing work, but I can drop and recreate these databases in a very quick manner. And that's one of those valuable things that would dramatically change how I develop things as a software developer. Just like testing dramatically has changed the way I've done things with modern unit testing frameworks. Now, that's not enough though, because I need to protect this data as well. And so this is Data Masker, which is part of SQL Provision as well. And what this allows me to do is build a number of rules that will execute either sequentially or in parallel, but they allow me to mask out data and do different things. So if I had that production data, I want some way to ensure that my developers, my testers, my build systems, they have a data set that's the shape of production, right? It's the size, it's the scale, it's the skew, it's got the amount of data I expect that has all the proper linkages in there, and it looks like real data, but it's not the real data. It's not data that's personal data that would be in violation of GDPR if this were released. So I could run these rules, but what I really want to do is run these in an automated fashion. And so let me go back. Here's my source database that I want to start with. And so actually, let me run both of these queries. So you can see I've got, Frederick Wademeyer, his email address, there's telephones and other things in my customer table. And then I have an employee table that has employee names and birthdays, tax IDs. These are all items that I may not want in development. Now, I need data there. I need something that looks good that my application can use and consume and process, but I don't want the real data to cause me problems. So I want to be able to deploy this to developers in a consistent manner, in an easy to use manner that they can use it, but it's not going to be actually the data that I'm worried about. And so what I'm going to do is I actually have a piece of PowerShell here. And again, I'm running this on a different domain. This is my lab domain, so I actually have to run this separately and authenticate. But what we'll see is that using a little bit of PowerShell, I've built an automated process. And this is actually going to take that live database that I showed you. It's going to create an image and then modify that image with Data Masker to protect out that PII information that I showed you. And then it's going to deploy a clone of that database to a developer. So I can send these clones out to different developers and they will be able to use them. It'll look like a data set they expect, but it will be a protected data set. And if I look here, you'll see I've got my image that I built, and then I've deployed this out actually to a different instance here. And so here was my source database, and as a matter of fact, let me zoom in and we go over here. This was my 2016 named instance. And if I come over here, I am on my 2016 QA instance over here. And let me find that database that I just deployed, which is GDPR. And I'm going to run the same query here. And when I do that, you'll see that I've actually masked out this information. So Frederick Wademeyer became Brandon Howdyshell. And I've changed out these email addresses. So these are actually emails that are hidden. And I could set this and configure Data Masker to pick invalid domains or my own domain or whatever I wanted to do. But the point is I would be able to change things around. When I go down and look at my employees, well, some interesting things, right? That Rosalind Tiemeyer became Zana Marcuson, right? I've left the person ID alone, even though I could have changed those if I wanted to. But this same row was changed. More importantly, you'll notice that the employee ID is the first 3 letters of the last name with some random number and then an alpha at the end, I've matched that up. So if my QA people or if my application is expecting to see this pattern among the rows, it still works. More importantly, I've slid the birth date around. Using Data Masker, I can decide not just to generate random days, because I may care about lengths of time and ages and things like that. I can specify some range that I want to just randomly alter a date by. So I want plus or minus a certain number of days, months, years, whatever. And then again, tax ID is something that I want to change again. I need a certain format, but I can easily do this. I could write all this in T-SQL, but this is a very easy way for me to do things with Data Masker. And one of the great things about things with Data Masker, like if I look at this rule, is that I can do things like I can write T-SQL in here. So I can say that I'm going to take the first initial and the last name to make an email address. And then for things like my domains, I could say I'm going to use a set of domains that are a known data set. And Data Masker gives me all sorts of known data sets like credit card numbers and date changes and addresses and things that I could use to mask my data set in a way that is much easier for me as a developer. I can do it rapidly as I add new fields and functionality. And then I can do things with SQL Clone that save me tons of disk space and use automation. So I don't think I have the automation script handy, but you know, just with PowerShell here, just by running a PowerShell script, I'm actually creating this system. And the idea here with SQL Provision, which is a known concept that other vendors do as well, is that I want to virtualize out my database as much as possible so that I'm saving disk space and then saving time, right? That was a 100 megabyte database. In about 7 or 8 seconds, it recreates that. It's not really, it's about the same time if that was a 100 gigabyte database. It's still going to be seconds to recreate a database. And again, about that 46, 48 megabytes of disk space, so I'm saving tons of space. And that gives me the ability to deploy multiple databases, have them provisioned for all my build and test environments, and I can use a realistic size data. Now, I also am protecting the data, so while it's realistic in size, we're actually masking out that data for compliance so that we're not disclosing any potential personal data in there, and then we're masking all kinds of data. I'm using PowerShell so that I have the ability to make a reliable, repeatable process that is automated so that I can hook this into a build process. I can hook it into any type of self-service system I have. So in TFS, there's ways to do this so that I reduce the load on my DBAs or my system admin people. They still get to control the environment so that it's a consistent environment in development, test, and production. But it's one of those things that can be handled in a self-service manner. And then I have a central view of all the ways that I do database copies. And SQL Clone also does include some role-based provisioning so that I can allow developers to build their own clones, but only DBAs or bonded personnel are allowed to build the images and access the production system. It's that thing. And maybe the best sentence about this is that I can build a deterministic process, right? The best compliance is going to be deterministic, so I always know what's happening. So I have the ability to prove that I did the right thing. And again, it's not that we count on Steve or Grant or Kathy or somebody to do the right thing. It's that the right thing is always done. And that's the way we want to approach things. And so that we agree on what the process should be, what's the boundaries based on the GDPR or other regulation, and then we ensure that the behavior is always done the same way because we've built a process that's repeatable and reliable. So that's all I've got for the webinar today. We've got some contact information if you have questions. Certainly SQL Provision at redgate.com works, and sales always works. That they're happy to pass you off to myself or Grant or tech support or whoever else can maybe answer questions. So those are great email addresses. Now we've got a whole data privacy and protection section on the website that you can view. And certainly we'd love for you to try SQL Provision. So if you'd like to try Data Privacy Suite or SQL Provision, download an eval, get a hold of us. We'd like to talk to you. So Karis, that's about all I have. Do we have some questions?
There are some questions in here. I know we're running slightly over time, so it might be an idea to actually go back to these people individually, because there are quite a lot of questions that have come through. Unless you're happy to take some more. Good?
Yeah, take a few.
Yeah, there's a few around Data Masker, in fact. So Should masking go as far as to mask usernames? So, for example, first name dot last name. They've said, I'm guessing yes.
Yeah. So one of the things, like I had here is that I masked an email address with this rule, and I said first name, last name, and email, and that ended up. Where's my data set? Let's just go to one of these here. That ended up going to say first initial, last name, and some other data that I chose. And certainly you could do that as well. So if I were building this, I could mask these columns and then have it flow to another column, either in the same row or into a different table actually. So I could ensure that if this were username, worked across tables.
Okay, and there's another question actually that's asking, can the rule be set so that masking changes the number of characters the same as what was in the original data? For example, changing the name Steve to David instead of something like Tom.
Boy, that's a good question. I suspect that what I'd have to do is do something in here where I'd calculate a length. I'd probably use some mathematical formula to do that. That's an interesting question, though. We should jot that down and double check.
Yeah, definitely.
That'd be an interesting one to solve. I think you can. I haven't really found. I've tried lots of things in DataMasker to find holes and edge cases, and it seems to be able to handle most anything I could throw at it. So, but we'll make a note of that and publish something about that.
Okay, and maybe just one more. Can DataMasker ensure that random data does not get randomly generated to the actual data item?
So you'd have to set a rule there that would say I don't want to allow certain things. So are you saying that in my mask set I can't have any Steve Joneses, or are you worried that Steve Jones might mask to Steve Jones? I believe that DataMasker doesn't allow the new item to be equal to the old item, so the original item to be equal to the target. But that's one we should check as well and be sure. I know that when I do DataMasker, for example, let me pop over here. If I were to add some other parameter, I would have picked something like there's credit card numbers that I can pick. I could generate invalid checksums or leave that alone, unique values only. I think there's a way to, well, some of these, if I generate credit card numbers, I could potentially generate a real credit card number, right? Because that's a limited domain of values. So for certain things, you don't want that to impact what you're trying to do. The key is that if I were to generate some random credit card number that were valid, I don't want that to have to match to a name and to an expiration date and to a CCV code, because together those things produce a piece of PII data. The number itself isn't necessarily PII data, because I can tell you what every credit card number in the world is right now because it's a known domain. So if I haven't answered that, maybe we ought to follow up, or whoever asked that, you should send us a note and we could discuss that in more information. I see one other, just real quick, postal codes. We have valid address data sets in here. So if I were to look at, let me just change this to addresses. So I could actually generate, I could say, based on a zip code or something, generate a valid address in the US, right? Which isn't PII information in and of itself, because you could figure out there's public records of every address in the US. What I don't want is that associated again with a particular individual or company or something else. So that's out there. Other than that, I think maybe any others, Karis, we should just answer, and then you'll send out later, as well as a link to the video of this, correct?
Yeah, I think we've covered most of them. So any that we have missed, I will follow up on. And yeah, we will be sending out the video, so you'll get a copy of that within a couple of days.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Thanks, Karis, for having me, and hopefully you've enjoyed it.
Thanks, Steve.